coming here. I'm Noel, the director of Lovelight. Can you all hear? Thank you for venturing to this part of London. This event marks the end of our operation in Hackney Week and the beginning of kind of starting of the new gallery here in London City Island. We have one more week of Danny's exhibition in our gallery in Hackney Week, which you're more than welcome to visit this weekend, and maybe another. We'll discuss that. I guess we've been, just quickly about what we do, we've been in Hackney Week for about 3 years, working really in new media and digital art. This year we focused on the theme of control. Danny's project is Outlet. We've been exploring the theme from different aspects, from social media to weapons and media, I guess, consumerism to neoliberal changes. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much, and Danny, take from here.
All right, welcome. I will talk a little bit about what's on show here in a second. Then we will go on with a panel which is chaired by Luke, who's not there at the moment, but he'll be back probably. But before that, I will show you a video that I've made as part of this project as well, that branches out a little bit further. What is the feedback? Annoying. Anyway. I'll switch off the light, or maybe Stelios, can you switch off the lights here and there too? Over there. Over there. I can do it. Is the sound on?
Wie schnell ist die eingeschossen?
Ich weiß es noch nicht, wer hat wieder was
Wer hat so jetzt damit geschossen?
Das wird aber wichtig. Nein, lass ihn ruhig fragen. Das ist der Schulleute, er ist super drauf. Weil gleichzeitig die Technik hat nur ein anderes Gewehr, ist trainiert sind alle gleichen Bewegen aus.
Beide von links. Ja. Super.
Aua. Fleck, das ist dann Fleck ist dann nicht Zentrum. Fleck ist in Uniform. Konfliktzentrum.
Ja, die König muss auch arbeiten. Ja.
Привет. Что?
И все?
Типа пакет. Аллах Акбар.
So this video connects to the exhibition, but it branches out beyond the specific area of focus of the exhibition. The exhibition deals with a few trips I made to Ukraine to look at the ways in which seemingly old-fashioned representations and performances with firearms coexist now with people being part of digital culture. And what I did in the broader scope of this project is to make a few trips across Europe to look at different instances of what I would argue is the return of firearms and the presence in the everyday, in the middle of digital culture. So that's the starting point for tonight. I'll now pass on to Luke, who is our chair. Maybe he can introduce himself, and he will probably introduce everybody else.
Cool. So, my name is Luke Robert Mason, and I was kindly asked by Danny and Arbeit to host the conversation and moderate the discussion this evening. I run a 24-year-old organization called Virtual Futures, whose aim is to bury the 20th century and begin work on the 21st. And so, let's begin. The way in which war is waged is undergoing the most significant change in history. And whilst the weapons have been upgraded and augmented, our perception of that warfare has been somewhat diminished. The launch of Call of Duty Modern Warfare, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was sold as the most realistic simulation of warfare ever. And for $60, you could pre-order a computer game that will be delivered on the 10th of November, only one day before Remembrance Day on the 11th. But what did the marketers really mean when they said the words most realistic simulation? Well, for the first time you would be able to play multiplayer across the globe and engage in massive online warfare scenarios. But there was a massive problem with what marketers considered to be realism. Yes, the graphics would be massively upgraded from the last version of the game, and you'd be able to immerse yourself in a high-resolution warfare environment, but for the game to be truly realistic, it would need for the restart option to be removed. In other words, every time a fellow player shot you, you wouldn't be able to restart or respawn back into the virtual environment. Indeed, for the game to be truly realistic, something had to be at stake. You had to be able to die. But there's a problem here. You'd end up paying $60 for a game where as soon as you were shot, you would be dead. No respawn, no restart, game over. And yes, this would be finally the most realistic simulation of war, but it's clear the marketers agreed that it probably wouldn't sell as many copies. So tonight we're here to talk about representations of Western warfare and armed violence, both high-tech and low-tech. This event has been curated in response to Danny Ploger's solo show Fronter Liebnis at Arbeit Gallery, and to further question expectations surrounding military and consumer technologies, please join me in welcoming our incredible panelists for the evening. So I'm going to kick off with Catherine Chapman, who's sitting to the right of me. Now, Catherine, you're a journalist who's worked in the Ukraine, and you've realized it's not just a question of how we think about weaponry or technology in warfare. What you're finding is another contested area in this space is also gender. Could you explain a little bit about your work in the Ukraine and what you've been up to?
Well, I write a lot about technology and culture, and my interest in things like surveillance systems and issues of privacy led me to always look at minority communities or on the fringe sort of groups. So the reason why I went to Ukraine predominantly the first time was where there was a revolution in warfare happening on the front line. There was also something that I gathered to be a sexual or gender revolution, something that I kind of marked at sort of a few years after the Stonewall riots in New York, which is true in what was happening. And so I've come to look at this topic very much in terms of the LGBTI community, as they call it there, and then also through gender in terms of the amount of women within the military. So working with the Ukrainian military, you see a lot in terms of new roles created for women, and then also challenging these notions of masculinity through whether it's the gay soldiers in the front line or the call for LGBTI equality within Ukraine itself.
So could you explain?
Oh, sorry.
I think some of these images are yours, or
This is actually
or is it just Danny VJing without?
Danny's VJing.
VJ with cat images.
This is the photographer, Lana Yanashova, who I worked with while I was in Ukraine. So we went with the Canadian military to one of their training bases in Western Ukraine, where they're training Ukrainian soldiers. This, to us, and unbeknownst to the Canadian military, was interesting because the Canadian military has one of the most inclusive for LGBT militaries in the world, number 6 actually. So I was very interested in the cultural influences of these two militaries working together, and also how things like homophobia comes up within the military construct. There's no women who were actually there, but there was also this problem when the revolution happened, is that the Ukrainian military basically was non-existent. So they had everyone, no matter where you were, if you were gay, if you were on the far right, if you were a woman, rushing to the front line to defend their country. And what happened was that women were doing a lot more roles, which they're not by law allowed to do in the Ukrainian military, which also includes access to military education. And so now they've kind of been forced, because there was no military force, to create these new positions for women, meaning that they actually get paid for the work that they're doing, because they're doing the role even though they're not contractually eligible to do. That's what I'm saying. So there's the Kalashnikov right there. I forget what the Canadians use. Alison might be able to fill in that. But the Canadians use a completely different type of rifle, so they were there to teach them sort of NATO standards and bring their military up like that, which is not just the Canadians there, it's also the US, the Lithuanians, which again, kind of, I'm sure we'll get into later, but relates back to this idea of the sort of, I guess the right would call it the LGBTQ agenda, and the fact that, you know, there's soldiers here from the West also turns into this sort of idea of the West infecting Ukraine with gay propaganda, as what Russia would put it as, more or less. So that's generally been my work in Ukraine, I would say.
Now we're going to return to some of your work and how you've navigated these sorts of environments as a journalist. But before we do, I want to turn to Chris Williams, who's an international relations scholar. And Chris, you started the Global Security Program in Cambridge, and you've seen these sorts of discussions that Danny so wonderfully demonstrated in the opening video almost come full circle over the last couple of years. Could you explain how that's happened?
Yeah. I almost want to ask Kat another question, why they all need yoga mats in order to fire guns, but it seems to be kneeling on them.
It was all very, like the Canadians were building, you should have seen it, they have like all these little sections, the Ukrainians are essentially like sleeping outside. The Canadians though, sorry, Alison will be able to like give more insight into the military. It was interesting having two culture journalists there. And my photographer just fawning over both men and women in uniform. But the Canadians would be like building a hut to do barbecues. Like it was quite very much a far place from what an actual, what the actual front line would be like. Even though there were these beautiful helicopters and parachute operations happening, so it was all very almost.
I was part of this thing called the Global Security Program at Cambridge, and at that time, basically, these were all the sort of theorists. And Cold War, what are they going to do for their livelihood? And so they thought, well, we've got to look at environmental things and development things and violence together. Interesting thing is, no talk about terrorism, little bit about asymmetric warfare. Everybody is much more concerned with climate change at that point. So partly the interest for me is, you know, why are we sitting here now, almost gone round in a circle, talking about guns that everybody was using during the First World War. It's not why have things changed, it's why don't they change, they just keep going like that.
But why do you think things haven't changed? Why do you think we don't have the expectations of sort of weaponry that we thought we would see within these sorts of environments? Could you talk a little bit more specifically about the sorts of changes we have actually seen?
Yeah, and a bit later I'll just come on to the idea that it's all about symbolism most of the time, and that actually a lot of the high-tech weapons are not really very helpful symbolically, but guns are. I've just been doing some stuff about museums and dark museums and so on, and one of the things that keeps coming back to me from the museum curators is, well, what the hell are we going to do in the future? Because kids aren't going to come to a war museum to look at a row of laptops and smartphones. You know, we need weapons.
So actually the next show at the Imperial War Museum is that for kids to come and learning how to defend themselves against the cyber attack.
Ah, okay. Oh, right. From their teachers, presumably.
Alison, I'm going to turn to you now. So, Alison, you're a former military veteran and a documentary photographer, but most recently, and after serving 15 years in the British military, you're now doing hostile environment training for journalists when they take it, and sometimes even artists like Danny. And you're involved.
Fake journalist.
Fake journalist. And you're involved partway in Danny's training, and during your time out in the military, you've re-examined your relationship with the British military, and I just wondered if you could explain how that relationship has changed.
Yeah. I had a specific route into this world now, which is a new world to me, which is the art world. And
Leave now.
I'm thinking about that. I did run over a field to get here, you can probably tell. I might run back over to get away. So I was a serving member of the British Forces. I joined when I was quite young. I didn't join to kill people. I didn't join to be part of the government's agenda. I didn't have any political view whatsoever. I joined because I had a shitty home life and I wanted a job and I wanted to travel. And over the years of doing that, I was eventually sent to Iraq in around about 2005. And it was the first time I really started to examine the complicity of the armed forces and how we dismantle culture and also invade other countries and destroy their culture. So I became quite political after Iraq, thanks to the military. And then I started to disassemble my own beliefs around occupation, around armed conflict. And the final straw that broke the camel's back was really a tour of Afghanistan, where I was photographing my colleagues and people around me, and through my personal relationships with them, watched them also dismantle themselves through various psychological disorders, including PTSD. So I examine a lot of things through that, through portraiture, through speaking to people. I don't actually identify as a military veteran. It's useful for this panel as a label, but it's not something I shout about. I don't go to Remembrance weekends or the 11th of November or anything like that. It's not something that I particularly can deal with right now. But I do care a lot about the way that women are represented in society in general. But the discourse of this is that the more that I focus on the role of women and how they're represented in conflict, the harder I find that to then think to reach a place of equality in the military, with then putting people in more armed roles, more frontline, more roles where we would kill people. So it's kind of an interesting space that I'm working through at the moment. But often I have seen and witnessed that if I Google the word soldier into a search engine such as Google it, Google. Oh, hey, Google. It always comes up as the highly masculine male warrior, sword wielding, gun wielding maniac, right? Or silhouette soldier sort of thing. Well, that doesn't represent anything to me. And a lot of the women you see on here, if you go to Carrie with the muddy sort of face.
I'm not
The
feeling
second
very
one.
well.
None of this speaks of warrior or soldier or any of the probably archetypal images you see of someone in the military. But she's 19 and she's in charge of an AS-90 gun, which has a range of 25 kilometres. So she pushes a button on one of the biggest weapons that the Royal Artillery hold. But when you look at her face, it doesn't really speak that to you. So the representation of people in the military and warfare is very warped anyway. And it serves a particular agenda, I feel, to do that. And the sensationalisation of the military, the exotic behaviour towards a uniform, seeing a uniform as sexual or hot, or somehow making someone more attractive, I find completely obscure to someone like me, who's been in the military and now sees it as a repulsive object that I would never want to wear again. So that's something I'm challenging with my work. It's very early. I might have to use photo montage to try and bring some of these narratives into it. But the work I've done with these women is 6 years of portraits through loads of different parts of conflict, whether they've been frontline, whether they've been supporting roles, etc. But they're not conventional portraits because the military hates things like this with wonky helmets and things not quite right and non-issue gloves on and the wrong rank, which is what Alex is wearing here. So there is a little bit of subversiveness about the work, but it's still got a bit of a way to go. So that's probably where I'm going to come up from with this discussion.
Well, Danny, I'm going to turn to you to talk specifically about imagery and representation. So Chris mentioned that the importance of the symbolism about the weapons themselves, the physical weapons, the physical guns. You've reduced, and we see it in the corner over there, you've reduced an entire weapon down to part of that representation. it represents the entirety of the weapon that Chris is referring to. Could you talk about how you've navigated these issues of high and low tech representation within this entire exhibit here at Armite?
Well, I think your introduction was really great in terms of explaining where my whole project comes from. I mean, I come from maybe the opposite end of the world Alison's talking about. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so never considering joining the armed force or whatever, even being very intellectually very averse to any kind of militarism. At the same time, I consumed popular culture continuously. Started with the A-Team in the mid-80s, through all that American stuff, and then you get into playing computer games and things. I realized then that all these representations of warfare, even though I am intellectually averse to these things, they have really shaped the way I operate in the world, and also the way I look at these things. In other words, something that I've actually, it's not just me, I see this a lot, but also in, kind of left-wingy art circles. Of course, we're all against war and stuff, but then when somebody's dressed up in a uniform, it's the story of your photographer, suddenly that's considered hot. There's a fascination with these things, which, and some of the work in the show, like there's this quote of Ernst Jünger there, I think they go back to a fascist perspective on the world, a proto-fascist idea where a cult of violence is really experienced as central to the formation of identity. I think that's also very key in a lot of American and also European sensational war production. So, in other words, what became kind of prominent for me is I felt that the fact that I recreated the A-Team with spades as machine guns when I was 5 in the sandpit, that really does shape me to a certain extent. And I can brush it off, of course. I can easily theorize, oh, that's bad, and it works like this, and I was indoctrinated in this or that way. But the reality is that this is part of me, and it's part of a lot of other people. So that's the starting point for this show. So it's very much about how do these representations work. Now, that work you asked me about, so I'll try to be a bit more brief now. What it is, it's a handguard from an AK-47, or actually from an AKM, so a Kalashnikov assault rifle, that's been heavily used for firing. You can see that because it's if you just use it for patrol, you don't hold that part so much. You can see the abrasion of the thumb and the hand on that part. So what fascinated me about that object is that that's something that's completely outside the story that I've just told you. In a computer game, you always have certainly created gun, but it doesn't have the abrasion of the physical contact with it. So this wooden part there, for me, it has all of it in it, right? It's this iconic gun, both of the left and the right, the Kalashnikov gun. It is the thing when you hold the gun, you know this is, when you have your eyes closed, you know this is a Kalashnikov because you hold that part. The rest can be anything, right? Like the buttstock or whatever, it's pretty generic, but it's that little piece. And then the fact that this also is the piece where there is a kind of engagement between the physical body and this machine of violence. There is something very, I don't know, it kind of boils it all down. It connects to a lot of the stuff. So what I did with this then is I 3D scanned it, and I inserted that part into a game environment. What you see in the video is the standard backdrop of Unity, the game developing engine, the blue sky. And then there's a gun that doesn't have a skin, so to say. Normally you put a skin on it so it looks like a real thing. It tries to simulate. This is the bare gun in its kind of pristine digital condition. But then I inserted this, kind of rotten, this object that has probably been in the world that you're describing. I put that into this, polished digital world. So that's I think this work kind of, it's the kind of nucleus of a lot of the stuff I've been interested in over the past 2 years or so.
I want to return to something that both Chris and Alison said with regards to this symbolic imagery of the military. Do you think there's further emphasis on these very understood tropes of military regalia and insignia as more and more of warfare becomes high-tech and to a degree invisible? So you did wonderful things, show us the face of the person, but presses the button on the drone that causes a degree of destruction or impact or engagement. And I just wonder whether we're doubling down on making the symbolic imagery so clear as we double down on actually making the realities of warfare more and more high-tech and more invisible.
Sorry. Well, first of all, it's not a drone. An AS-90 is an actual physical field gun.
Right.
It has tracks on it, looks like a tank. So it's quite a big piece of equipment. And a lot of the military weaponry is still kind of low-tech with a lot of digital technology added onto it, right? Some of it's still very old equipment that's being utilised as things have progressed. If you want to use the word progress, I don't know, more digress is the best way of going it. But I don't know, because the answer to that question has lots of layers to it, because symbology that's used in gaming culture has got more accurate to actual regiments, in the sense that now when you enter it, you talked about people can die on, what's it called, Call of Duty, right? I have military friends who play Call of Duty, and they played it in Afghanistan before they actually got into their Apache attack helicopter and went out and carried out a flying mission. So they would play this game with all their mates on a sofa in a tent in Camp Bastion, and they would get a call to go and then kill some members of the Taliban. And they were playing this game because they felt they could actually relate to it. And again, so when we talk about badges and uniform and rank structures, the gaming world's done a lot of research on how to make it more realistic, scarily realistic.
I think it was one of the requests actually that I saw the Canadian military had wanted for them to be sent was Call of Duty, but then there was also things like Hello Kitty and really weird sort of it's kind of scary, because don't we as people, even from a child, we get badges for swimming, we get badges for we get certificates, we get things that we put on scouts uniforms and guides uniforms. The military is no different. People like wearing their crossed "I'm the best sniper" badge, right? There's this weird thing about that's badges, right? But that is a form of symbology. But it's very important to know what rank someone is, or what regiment they're from, what unit they're from. I think Ukraine, I know you asked Chris, but I think Ukraine is the flip version of that almost, because no one liked joining the Ukrainian military before. Everyone got out of their conscripted service. They got rid of conscription a year before the conflict started, and then they brought it back. But no one was joining, and it didn't matter if you were gay or if you weren't. You just didn't go because it was totally corrupt. They weren't doing anything. The training wasn't there. But now that they're getting these sort of high-tech weapons and getting this high training from Western forces, you see more and more people wanting to go. The volunteers, battalions actually now becoming incorporated within that military. So there's more of this, high regard of the Ukrainian military rather than it's shit, don't.
But that's not only, it's not only the technological issue, because the guys I was with, you see they only have rubbish, right? They only have the old stuff that used to, so there's also that everybody now joins because there is this nationalist, or whatever you call it, project. For them it was a nationalist project, for others it's a European project. But the interesting thing was the fixer I was with, he had dodged military service, as you say, and now it's a kind of weird situation where he was now all pro-military, and kind of a military guy himself because he did so many of these trips, but he had dodged it. And then the guys I was with there, they were these poor guys really, with really low rank, if you would call it like that, in civilian society positions. They were unemployed or whatever, students. They're fighting really with rubbish, really, old stuff from the 80s.
Yeah, I was just interested in this idea about there's actually in some ways nothing new, they're just layering new technologies on top of old things. Yesterday I was taking 4 Koreans around the National Army Museum, and one of the galleries, which is a bit iffy, you go into it, and above it says yes, no, would you be a soldier? And it actually counts who goes through which side. And then as you
That's
go...
from this movie, The Square.
It doesn't tell you that as you go through, by the way. It doesn't tell you. And then anyway, you go around there, and they're using lots of. They think they're using lots of virtual reality things and so on, including a regimental sergeant major who comes up on the screen and tries to put them through regimental drill and right dress and left dress and saluting, all that sort of thing. But being Britain, the only thing is that most of it doesn't work. Now, try explaining to 4 Koreans why the technology in a museum doesn't work. They have no comprehension of this. And then they look at the weapons and say, well, how do you drive a drone if you can't even drive a projector?
Well, that's the point, right? Most of these things do great.
And then the fantastic own goal is, at the end of this, then you go out again through yes and no things. And it counts. And at the entrance, as you go out, it has the score of how many people said yes at the beginning and how many people said yes at the end. At the beginning, it's around 60% walk through the yes. At the end, it's around 30%. Oh, no. And I was asking some kids, well, why is it? They said, nothing works. I'm not going off with that lot if they can't even get a video to work.
That is the British military.
It's the British military.
I feel like what Danny said though about you, these guys that you're with, it did, like the gear was so old and dated.
Or they would buy it themselves, right?
Or they would buy
That's in the
themselves.
Dutch army as well.
But I find this equally interesting because, you know, the WannaCry cyber attack, that virus originated from Ukraine. Like all these sort of like cyber technical abilities from the sort of hackers really do live in a lot of them live in Eastern European countries, particularly Ukraine.
But it'd be fascinating to find out, going back to this sexualization thing again, is what is it about these uniforms that transfers into being identified as sexy? Because I used to have friends who would only date men if they were in the SAS. Because they had like, and I never used to understand that. And these were friends who weren't in the military.
Yeah, well, why did all the soldiers' eyes light up? And I was like, can you teach me how to like load that Kalashnikov? And like suddenly it was like a whole circle around me. Now I'm really into it.
But I think this goes back to the kind of thing that Junger writes about in the 20s already, right? A cult of strength, violence, all these kind of things together that are considered to be something, you know, kind of rite of passage to a new nation and all this kind of stuff, a kind of purification, right? Strong people, like all these kind of ideas. I think that part of it is that. The idea of people in uniform representing the warrior, it has a kind of fascination with this kind of idea, I think, that, you know, strong people in a kind of, you know, it's a fascist concept.
And there was always this
Well, in a sense, some of the imagery of indoctrination that we're kind of referring to, whether it's the weapons themselves or the uniforms themselves. And then you've got some more clips of some of the things that we look at from a generational perspective as kids, both whether it's computer games or toys and Nerf guns and action movies.
Yeah, can we first do something else though? I'm good.
Oh yeah, why not?
Because yeah, this is one thing, right? The representation of computer games and how that interacts with the real world. But I think something that's been going around now is this idea, like, you know, it's the old guns with some technological add-ons. This may very well be the reality on the ground, if you like, but I think there is something very particular in the way warfare has been represented since the 1990s until now. Because what we see in the early 90s is the beginning of the emancipation of the computer as a general device that everybody has and that's everywhere, as opposed to a specialist thing that's either a hobby or something at a university. It starts in about the 90s. At the same time, we see throughout the 90s is more and more focus on this idea of the smart bomb, the high-tech war thing, a war where the ground soldier is no longer necessary. And now we get this back. So what I'd like to show is two short clips that is this generational thing. Because one is from the early 90s and the other one is from like last year, which I think show what's going on.
This is the SRAM missile with a camera in its nose striking
Can we
a
have more
hard
sound?
hangar. The first missile in this attack goes straight home. The second, however, wobbles before locking back onto its target and a devastating hit. General Schwarzkopf took particular pride in the precision with which his military could hit what they wanted, while not hitting people involved in non-military pursuits.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror,
So this is 91. I think this promise is... Oh.
It's the biggest change in British Armed Policing in a generation. We've been given unprecedented access to the new recruits.
on me, close door right, split.
The ones who could be first in, facing the terrorists. They are armed and carrying big responsibility.
So this really, for me, is a kind of starting frame where we see, and of course this is not black and white, but throughout the 90s until the mid-2000s, there's been more of a focus on this idea of this fantastic smart bomb or the Predator drone, whatever, that only hits the bad guys and will never make any collateral damage. That thing is completely collapsed. If you look on YouTube and you just Google drone or Predator or whatever, 9 out of 10 reports will be about how these things actually don't work and hit the wrong people or don't even fly at all. And now,
I think they're retiring the Predator.
well, there's also the new one, whatever. But I think that these things now are really increasingly questioned, and instead we get really a foregrounding. Of course, it's never been totally gone, but it's really a foregrounding of this sort of thing. You know, this special forces elite unit, but which essentially is something that we had way back, if you like, in the imagination as well. So that's kind of the for me. An interesting thing to look at. What does that mean? That we now, there was this kind of thing where it goes together, right? Consumer technology becomes more high-tech. Partly it is military technology we have here as well. GPS, the best example, came from the first Gulf War. It went in parallel with this imagination, maybe not the reality, but an imagination of warfare, Western warfare, that's a high-tech affair. And now there seems to be some sort of a split, at the point where everybody, even poor soldiers who don't even get paid for their work in Ukraine, have high tech. They had GoPro Hero 4 devices. Everybody has these devices. At this point, we see the return of this image of the ground war soldier that looks archaic by the standards of this 1991 clip, right? Imagine 1991, it was all, now we have smart bombs, it's those like, the enemy who sits in the sand with their Kalashnikovs, but we have something completely different. Anyway, so that's the intervention now.
Well, I want to turn again to Chris, because I know you've been looking specifically, and you have some slides to talk about this, about the symbolism of these different types of weapons, technologies, and military figures. So, Danny, you have those slides.
I have the controls here of the things.
Every talk needs some slides.
I'll come
So
and
every
drive
time
you.
needs a Chris.
I can do it.
Okay.
So
So
I can go away.
Bring some intelligence into
why has it gone off?
But you shouldn't
Stand in front of it.
You're standing in front of it. You should sit on the chair.
Chris, this is a low-tech era.
So Danny gave us these 3 questions a few months ago, so that's been my starting point. And, nothing new. Liverpool strikes in 1911. Militarised police with guns wandering around. I love looking at our war statues. If you go around our war statues, this one's in the Mall, loads of guns on the street already, including documenting our war crimes in China. This was the Boxer Rebellion, and there we are, digging the bayonets into everybody. So, it's great for Chinese tourism now, they can come and see these things. So the questions that came up to me about all this was, can the guns actually be used? Because if you're in an airport, can you really shoot these guns? Has there ever been an example of something being in the right place at the right time? Armed police patrols being in the right place at the right time? And do they, as we've heard before, do they actually deter, reassure, or protect? Actually, National Army Museum again, a couple of months ago, the military were there answering these questions. Can they be used? Of course not. Have they ever been in the right place at the right time? No, except possibly at the Louvre, and that's only because the police have guns anyway, so they're already there. And do they deter, reassure, and protect? And then no, and then they added, from a military perspective, if you're holding a gun on patrol for more than 15 minutes, your mind's frozen. You won't react as quickly as you would if you're actually on active service in a trench. So pretty useless. So why? Well, of course the reason is because it's much the same thing. The statue, the symbolism of the statue and the police is the same. And as we've seen, strange, the police love having their photographs taken now. Remember, so many countries...
In Belgium, no. It
Well,
was
exactly.
the only guys I could
This is the
find
point.
there.
In many countries, you get put in prison if you take photographs of police. But here, they'll let you pose, you know, with them. So there's a problem that the terrorists have got, which is how you scale up a small terrorist act into a large terrorist act, this thing of scaling up. And a little bit of theory from Margaret Mead. She was talking about prefigurative stuff, co-figurative, and post-figurative. In other words, what happens before, what happens at the same time, and what happens after. Well, a bomb does the last thing. It only has a post-figurative effect. It goes off, and then you get your media clips. On the other hand, with a gun, it does all three. Because everybody's filming and you put videos up beforehand like the police do. When it actually happens, the media's there filming it all great. And afterwards, those clips just go on and on and on. So actually, it's really good value for money. You get three for the price of one. More bang for your bucks, as it were. So another trick, of course, that we all know about the terrorists is that they deploy the resources of the state and turn the resources of the state on the state. Classic example, so they steal the planes and turn the buildings into bombs, and we get 9/11. Much, much bigger and much, much more effective. So I'm just wondering if what we're seeing with all this, actually, that the terrorists are actually redeploying the state forces with their guns around the street just to scale up the effect. Even if they're not consciously doing it, that's what they're doing. Our daft policymakers are actually doing the terrorists' work for them in terms of scaling up. Of course, therefore, we have a coincidence of interest, lovely phrase, that everybody actually wants this to happen. Orwell, of course, perpetual war. Everybody wants a sort of perpetual war. Every side wants to do this. So we might as well have new police T-shirts actually saying terrorists kill. Okay, it's okay with everyone. So what are the artists doing? This is another one of Danny's questions. This is one of my favourite little tour trips with people. This sort of counter to the standard war memorial, the women's war memorial in Whitehall. And of course it's showing the unknown women via the uniforms, empty uniforms of the jobs that women were done as nurses and telegraph officers, fire watching, and they're just sort of hung on coat pegs. So that's rather a nice response from artists. This is even nicer, I reckon, in Seaham. Just on the seafront there, Ray Lonsdale, local artist, was asked to do a war memorial, and he chose to do somebody coming back in World War I with PTSD. And the council was happy with this because it was actually letting everybody have a slightly different idea of the war. Transient stuff seems to be rather interesting. This was this year in front of the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. The Mud Soldier. It's made out of mud from Passchendaele, and it was put there, and of course after 4 days, good old British rain had washed it away. That's it. That was the statement. Very, very nice little instalment. And in the same sort of genre was this fantastic thing at Birmingham where she's a Mexican artist, Azevedo, and she got 5,000 little ice victims. She formed them in plastic drinks bottles and bent it around, put them all on the steps there, and they last 2 hours. They just sort of melted away into nothing, into some sort of abyss. So the artists are doing their bit. So the artists actually got the same problem as well. I've just been working with these museum curators in Cambodia and Vietnam, and they are using artists on their war sites. It's the anniversary of the My Lai massacre. My Lai massacre has nothing left. That's what happened. The Americans burnt it all. So they actually deploy artists to do various things to sort of scale up. Cambodia, of course, they pile up lots of bones. So I got very interested in this scaling up thing. So back to Crimea. And so, you know, the artists in the past would sit there drawing thousands and thousands of little soldiers to try and give an idea of how awful things were. And if you have a little bit of analysis of this sort of thing, the artists do various things throughout history. They repeat things, they use patterns, and then of course the usual sort of things of perspective. Vertical perspective is in ancient Egypt, where you put the foreground underneath the top people, or it's supposed to be in the background. It's supposed to be like that, but there's no idea of perspective that we know. And then there's overlapping. In actually 100 BC in Pompeii, there's the Alexandria War, and they use an overlapping system of legs overlapping to give an idea of perspective. So we didn't invent perspective in Europe in the 18th century. It was invented a long time ago in Pompeii. And then the idea, of course, what we've got here, this sort of graphical linear perspective. So my thought after this for tonight was just that there is now another way of scaling up, which is Danny's 3D 360 camera, because you can actually get a lot more in your screen. So maybe you're part of a genre change as well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
From Chris's presentation, I want to turn back to one of the panelists, really, Catherine, Danny, and Alison, to talk about, again, this idea of symbolism and imagery, because it feels like, from Chris's presentation, we got two things down. We do very well when it comes to recruitment with imagery, and we do very well when it comes to remembrance. When it comes to the representation or the revealing of the realities of warfare, we are in very tricky spaces. So I wonder, as artists, as journalists, and as a practitioner in your own right, how do you deal with the tricky realities, how do you deal with the trickiness of representing a reality without putting a degree of your own subjectivity into it?
Well, that's the conflict of bearing witness and documenting, and then how we produce and share the work and the spaces that we choose to share it in, isn't it, really? So I wouldn't, I'm just trying to reflect on some of the stuff that I've done. Because I know that I photographed with a certain bias initially, because I was still very new out of the military. But the book that I was doing, I can't do anymore because I've changed my perspective on that over the years. So I think it's difficult because if you look at generic military imagery, it's supporting a strong message, isn't it, on perhaps propaganda or the way that it's messaged out into society. And I think Dan is going to move on to talk about some recruitment videos and how they're very polished and advertising campaigns. So I think as artists and certainly as photographers or documentarians, we have to look for the unseen narrative, the things that aren't there. And I think the banality and the mediocrity of war is something that people often don't see, and the boredom and the sitting around and the talking about crap and the letters from home and the wearing the odd coloured socks because they've got nothing else to do but change the colour of their socks. So those things I think are really important to capture as artists. And I think some of the strongest work I've seen, and certainly influenced me to go in the direction I did, was from photographers such as Tim Hetherington, who did a piece called Sleeping Soldiers, which was just people asleep in Sangin. So, and not the expected portrayal of soldiers in war in Afghanistan. So I think I know it sounds really cliche, but it's looking for humanism, isn't it? Humanity in those instances, because we talked yesterday about sometimes the left wing kind of paints everybody who's in the army as being bad, but really the system is bad, the institution is bad, not the person. The person is a victim of the system, so therefore the representation of the person will always be quite important to me, and the aspects of being a human being within inside a uniform. So that's how I would approach it.
No, I think sometimes, even though when it's in the middle of a conflict as complicated as Ukraine, sometimes the humanity, it doesn't matter. So because you go into Ukraine and it feels like you almost have to choose a side. You're either with the Russians or you're with the West. And there's a lot of conversations that I had with people there, and I think Danny did as well, where it was like, oh, Catherine, do you know this journalist, this Western journalist? I'd be like, no, I don't know him. Oh, well, he's terrible. He's been reporting bad things about Ukraine. So it's very much choice. Put that on top for me with the with writing about fight for sexual equality becomes even more complicated, because while I wanted to focus on just these soldiers who wanted to be free to fuck whoever they wanted, essentially, it turns into a view of Western intervention. It turns into you see Ukraine passing laws for LGBTQ rights, but to appease Europe, so they get more support from Europe, but not actually supporting it when it comes to ridding homophobia or stuff from society. When my report actually got published, I then got a call from Russian television being like, hey, how did you do this report? Because they were calling me out for not only working for an American organization, but on top of that, I'd also gotten travel funding from an American organization, which if you go back far enough, it's very much American foreign policy, giving aid to whether it's people to start up businesses or to journalists to report from the conflict. So you almost find yourself in the center of this, even if you just want to do something like writing about sexual equality. It becomes more of, you know, America causing the conflict or not. And then on top of that, it's really interesting because within the gay community, a lot of, you know, gay couples that I met were going to Moscow to live their life free and openly. So it's a lot more complicated. When you were speaking about you not identifying with you know, military veterans, it would be the same thing. Not everyone wants to identify with pride marches and things like that. They just want to, because it's become so political. So there's tons of layers in terms of how to be, whether it was objective or tell stories properly.
Yeah, but I think we should really move away from this idea of subjective journalism or reporting versus objective reporting. I think the important issue here is that we acknowledge that all the reports are subjective and that we expose as much as possible in what way they are subjective. So, and I think this multitude of perspectives is what one should strive for, and that also taps into something we talked about yesterday night. I think it's totally understandable that an active or ex-service person, when they go to Age of Terror exhibition in the War Museum, that pisses them off, because you know it does, you know, that does present a certain critical perspective which is valid. But the issue with that is also, as you say, that it sometimes discredits an acknowledgement that there are different worlds from which these things are enacted. And I think the difficult one is that there is, to just say, okay, a person is the victim of the system, I mean, that might not be, there is a kind of thing, there is a degree of agency and there is a degree of being embedded in a system, which is both for the people that might be represented in reports, but it's also for the person who is representing. So the fact that you've been supported by North American governments in this story means you can just say, oh, I was just doing this story, but that's a classic case of what Chomsky writes about, right? When he talks about the freedom of media. It's absolutely true that all these journalists for American newspapers, they can write whatever they want. But then if you look at their CVs and how they finally ended up in this position, it shows that over a period of time they have demonstrated that they will not, out of their own free will, write the wrong things. I'm pretty sure that if you would apply with the European government to do reports that show that there are indeed 90% neo-Nazis fighting on the front line in Ukraine, it will be much harder to get funding than when you say, I'm going to show that there is really many people who are transgender who can fight in the Ukrainian army.
Then I would have taken it, but Russia isn't offering funding and that sort of...
Of course, but the issue is that even though you might write your story without any kind of bias, the reality is that you writing your unbiased story, of course your story is biased, but pretended it may be unbiased, right? There's other people who write a so-called unbiased story who will not get funding because that unbiased story doesn't fit into the greater narrative of a certain political power. So, you know, that works the same in the art world. There's some things that are okay and some things that are, you know, less okay. And that's not in the individual. It's not like, oh, I have a dark plan. I'm with my artwork going to, you know, broadcast some sort of message that will militarize society or not. It's more that I'm completely free to do whatever I want, but depending on the choices I make, I will be more or less successful in getting funding and exhibitions.
Well, I think it's difficult as well, especially if we were going back to arms and talking about the defense sector. Like, you might not want to always be so critical of, you know, the Americans approving such and such a sale to Ukraine, because then you've lost half of your contacts if you're going to just blast it immediately. So you have to sometimes pick and choose when you feel like you want to be critical.
Not to get bogged down in subjectivity, objectivity issue, but Danny, you've made very specific decisions as to when you are revealed within your work. So the 360 piece you were showing, you are very present. When we saw these moments of sometimes comedy, where you were very calmly sitting in the foreground of the imagery that you were showing. I just wonder where that plays into this discussion, if there was a reason for that, and if so, what that reason was. Were you trying to some degree, reveal the fact that you were the subjective artist in that space, or is there something more aesthetically nuanced going on there?
Well, I think there's something has been going on in this project which hasn't been completely resolved. It's what is my place in this really? Because of course I want to, expose my own subjective presence. But what does that mean? Because the VR exhibition or installation that's on in the exhibition in Wallace Road, maybe not all of you have been there, it's open Thursday to Saturday as well. There, so the story is this: I went to Ukraine to exactly document that thing that Alison also mentioned. The reality that being on the front line is most of the time just waiting around. So what you see in this video there in the pink room is I'm sitting with these soldiers and they're showing me stuff on their phone in a distance you can't really even recognize. It doesn't really matter. And we're sitting in this former children's camp which is completely shut up, and there's some birds flying around, and there's the munition cases there. I wanted to document that. And the problem, I didn't choose this footage in the end for the installation because there was something quite odd with it. I mean, what am I actually doing there, right? It's kind of weird. And they're sitting with these guys there, and they were saying, okay, we're just going to sit here and we're making a recording. The actual footage I used is, I went there, I told the fixer, okay, I want to go to places where there's no contact. Of course, there's loads of those in Ukraine because that conflict is most places static. So Mariupol, the area where we went, he said, okay, that's where really not much happens. So we'll go there, we go to positions where nothing happens. I asked the soldiers, and they said, it's dangerous everywhere. They can shell here, they can shell there, no problem, come with us. So the fixer said, okay, you go with them, check it out. It was the recce, we're not going to film yet. He went somewhere else. I went with these guys, and we got into this firefight. So that's the video I showed you. That's the phone. It was totally unplanned. I was the fake journalist who didn't want to see the action, unlike all the others. And I got into it. After that was over, we walked on, and then there were these guys having a rest. And I thought, maybe this is a good place to film later on. I just took out the camera and I just took a shot of about 10 seconds. And then for the rest of the time I was there, nothing happened, right? The only stuff, we went to these places and it was all really boring, and I did what am I actually doing here? So in the end, it was that thing, because there it was clear, like I'm kind of freaked out. It's very clear I'm out of place. I'm the only guy wearing a helmet, because of course Alan told me to. Very good. So I was the guy. So they were all sitting there. So there it was very clear. I was there as an outsider. It was kind of awkward, and it's not. But I'm there filming, so it actually shows that I'm that person who's doing that. So that's why I picked that footage. Much to the distress of William, who's over there, who edited this footage. We had 10 seconds, which was wobbly, and it was a complete disaster. And he turned it into, the footage that you could see on the other side. Anyway, so there's continuously this thing. So the reason why the selfies are in there is on the one hand, like the thing with the soldiers when I'm sitting there, it was also just, I'm also just kind of there, like, oh yeah, I was here. There's a kind of sense of, just what you do with a cell phone. This is a mobile phone recording. So once it had quieted down, you can see it's a quiet moment. You just hear this one RPG flying over. We're just sitting there like, we're having some water. And I thought, I'll just take a selfie shot, as one does. So I think what the selfie shots do in a way, they, and that kind of worked for me. It kind of really bridges the sense that I was there on this kind of mission, if you like, but I was also just there being. And like being this kind of ordinary social media consumer like they are, because they're continuously fiddling with their devices. So then for me personally, it worked like that. In the actual video, it also then exposes that this video is part of the same economy as that they're in, right? They're also working with these devices all the time. So the reason why I transferred this fragment to 16mm is to really emphasize that even more. You see a 16mm film, the medium of the Vietnam War, of the the Russian and the Afghanistan War, all documented on 16mm. So you're watching this thing. When you see the guns, you think, oh, that's right. It's probably some guerrilla thing like back in the 60s or 70s. And then suddenly you see these guys with phones. That's not quite right. But you also got a selfie shot. That's not possible with a 16mm camera. So I did that on purpose for that reason. So there's kind of a double. There's maybe a kind of formalist conceptual thing, but there's also just just me being some really stupid guy ending up in a situation that, kind of a war tourist, like the two guys that were the training as well. I did the training.
Genuinely were.
Yeah, I did this training, and there was all like journalists, and I had this project in the Ukraine, but there were two guys who said, we just like to go on holidays to like places like Afghanistan and Syria, so that's what we're doing this course.
That's the one I accidentally shot in the head.
That's another story.
Yeah.
That's a story I want to hear, but it feels...
It was the best thing he experienced in the whole week, he said afterwards. Being shot in the head whilst taken hostage with a bag over his head.
That's one for afterwards. And I would also recommend going and chatting with William, and the most interesting conversation I had at Danny's opening was the actual mechanics of how that VR artwork is put together. So do grab the gentleman in the back and ask what is going on there, because there's a lot more happening in 60 seconds of footage than we realise. I'm not sure if you wanted me to give away the magic.
The bottom line is that it's much more difficult than you think, but also what we did in the other work, this is a straightforward documentation, but the other work works with all sorts of small loops, so it looks like it's a never-ending situation, but it's only 10 seconds.
So it feels like the impression I'm getting from the panel is that the most dangerous and the most important weapon in warfare is visual culture itself. He was showing us the images of 9/11 that was able to start an entire war. And Danny, I just want to return, I know you want to show some more video imageries of the sorts of things around recruitment, unless you want to jump slightly forward in interest of time, but let me know where you want to go.
Yes.
Because if you want, we can do a little bit of recruitment, but also looking at inroads, looking at time.
Well, we've got 20 minutes.
So 20 minutes,
Oh, we play another video, I was afraid.
You went to the Ukraine, you can't suffer more than an hour and a half.
No, that's
I think
And then the panel doesn't normally go to the toilet.
the panel can definitely, anybody can go to the toilet. In the meantime, by means of intermission, what you're saying that in a way that the digital media are the worst enemy, I mean in a way also they're not, because I think one of the reasons why the image of the ground war soldier, but also why we now know or have a sense of, you know, the gore of what a Predator drone can do, but also just what everyday warfare can be like, we get this because now big media don't dominate visual culture anymore, right? The reason why in the 90s we were continuously looking at that green screen from above with those crosshairs is because that was on TV. Now we get all these people, it doesn't matter, they're Ukrainians, they're US and UK military, there are IS fighters, they all put their headcam stuff on YouTube. There's hours and hours of that footage. So I think in a way, I mean, I wouldn't call it like positive, but it has really changed. It has actually, I think, contributed to the end of the myth of high-tech warfare as some kind of a just, clean thing. On the other hand, I mean, I think it's a double thing.
In one sense of Christians, where imagery of terrorism and what is desired and desirable both by the terrorists and by those reporting on the terrorists. So you showed us the image of 9/11, the scale of that image, the fact that it was probably the last top-down, mediatized event that we've had. It is the science fiction author Douglas Copeland talks about the fictional drug 9-tenicillin, which is in the US verbatim every single year. CNN dedicates a TV channel to replaying the entire news from that day ad infinitum. And if you look at it back, there's only two things that culturally shock you. One, it's the fact that it's filmed in 4:3, not 16. And the second thing is, if you actually look, because this has been spent 15 or 16 years since 9/11, and you look at the people on the streets, and the clothing is very much the same. There were 16 years between Beatles and punk, and aesthetics changed massively, and there's been massive technological development, but in terms of cultural development, it's very retromania. You can recognize the individuals on the streets as sort of individuals we see on the streets today. The other thing you don't notice is nobody is holding their shiny glowing rectangle to the sky to take a picture of this event from the ground. And there is a big question mark over whether how our perception of terrorism would change in the social media age. Perception of terrorism at that sort of scale. We haven't seen a terrorist incident at that sort of scale that has been mediatized through the people on the ground. We only get to see 4 or 5 approved shots of the planes going into the buildings, and I don't want to slip into conspiracy theory realm, but there's a reason for that. It's controlling the consciousness of individuals on the ground. That is still our representation of terrorism. I just wonder, how has that changed? What is desired and what is desirable? Because we don't get to see anything like that.
Yeah, and just quick thoughts on that. The Age of Terror exhibition at Imperial War Museum, actually the opening exhibit is mobile phone footage from very, very primitive mobile phones. But it's awful. you realise exactly what you say.
Oh, that's a handicam, actually.
Is it handicam?
Yeah, but it is one of those.
I mean, whatever it is, it's pretty awful.
One of those things.
The other thing, just the conspiracy theorists, actually another whole tranche of stuff that's available is the architects and the engineers who are doing all the stuff about these planes could not have done this much damage. And they've got a whole wealth of stuff online, which you look at it and you think, oh, well, good, they're questioning, what's happening. Of course, they're not. They're adding to it. They're just scaling up what everybody wants. They're doing the terrorist's job and they're doing the state's job.
So
in a
that
slightly
Sky
different way.
report, like that was propaganda. There was a reason why Sky was allowed
Well, the
to.
press officer, the police let them in, right? It's a full on.
Yeah, it's the same
They
thing
are
when you read reports of like, oh, these are many terrorist attacks or stops. I did a thesis on the intelligence agency's relationship with the media, and so all these things are very much, and that's been a complete different change from 9/11, where there's less openness, and we see the agencies moving on to Twitter or moving on to social media to give up their information. But all that stuff is very much place.
Yeah. I think another big question is, how do we know that terrorists actually cause terror? Beyond the people who were actually involved, which of course is a horrible event for those, it's very difficult to prove that it actually has any effect. After the 7/7 bombs, everybody was back on the buses and trains again. There was no, reduction in people travelling. A few people might have travelled in a slightly different way. But to prove terror in an individual person is quite difficult, because you have to do things like heart rate and dilation of pupils and temperature and those sorts of things. How the hell do you do that in a population of millions? You can't actually prove that terror works in any way. Yet we sort of believe it does, because everybody wants to believe it does.
But you can show like what you have like in Brussels, where, for example, the prices of airplane tickets dropped to about £5 or £10
that's
for
interesting.
like 3 to 4 months after the airplane takes. But I think to connect to this, I think that although we've not had terror attacks or any other violent incidents on that scale, the mobile devices have changed also the way we have access to and kind of scaled up a lot of the small events. Because if you look at this is like the Rigby incident here. So the sound.
Muslims are dying daily by British soldiers, and this British soldier is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. By Allah, we swear by the Almighty Allah, we will never stop fighting you until you leave us alone. So what if you want to live by the Sharia in Muslim lands? Why does that mean you must follow us and chase us and call us extremists and kill us? Rather, you lot are extreme. You are the ones. When you drop a bomb, do you think it hits one person, or rather your bomb wipes out a whole family? This is the reality. By Allah, if I saw your mother today with a buggy, I would help her up the stairs. This is my nature. But we are forced by the Quran in Surah At-Tawbah, through many ayahs throughout the Quran, that we must fight them as they fight us. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I apologize that women had to witness this today, but in our lands, our women have to see the same. You people will never be safe. Remove your government, they don't care about you. You think David Cameron is going to get caught in the street? When we start busting our guns, you think the politicians are going to die? No, it's going to be the average guy like you.
Well, I'll let it play till here, because I think that woman with her shopping cart passing by is quite significant. I mean, this is like totally incredible, right? And this guy with the blood on his hands, literally, and the knives there. It's filmed by somebody on a mobile device, and even the people right next to it don't quite pay attention to it. So there's really a very strange thing going on around scale here, and the mobile device plays a really big role in this. Because without the mobile device, I mean, yeah, this this whole thing would have a completely different or fewer dimensions.
But I wonder now with like so much talk of censoring the internet or whatever, whether that stuff would even be, you know, whether it would be flagged immediately, not being able to play online.
Well, the Sun like this, I mean, not to...
This is an example, but now I feel like a lot of the stuff you can no longer view or broadcast immediately because there's so much regulation regarding so-called terrorist content.
Mm-hmm. Which in a way makes sense.
Recently, they broadcast something that was really sensitive. What it was. No, it's gone. Does anyone know?
What are you talking about?
Someone put something online like last week, a video. No.
Is it the YouTube budget?
The what, sorry?
The YouTube budget app?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't...
In the forest, suicide forest.
Oh, the
Yeah.
YouTube star.
Yeah.
What's his name?
In
Yeah.
Tokyo.
Logan Paul and the Suicide Forest, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, they came across the body.
The showing of the dead body on the Suicide Forest. Well, again, it feels like visual culture does recruitment and remembrance very, very well. It feels like it's got those two down to pat, but do you think there's a degree of expectation now where we're seeing, the reason we're seeing the same imagery is because that's what individuals are expecting from warfare. We're demanding it, we're desiring it. We want to have every terrorist incident to have the same sort of scale as something like 9/11, which is why we have this desperation to put ourselves at the center of the story. Where you were seeing the social media arbitrage of the things like the London Bridge event, where people were messaging, "Oh, I was there 2 weeks ago." It's like you have no part of that story in terms of timeline, but yet you feel you need to make yourself part of that. And we've had issues with regards to 9/11 where people have made false reports because they said, "I was there, I was in the building, I was on the ground." It turns out they weren't there, and what they're getting is these visual images basically replaying. And again, when it goes from the recruitment image of the CNN news footage all the way through to the remembrance experience, it feels again like they're forcing a form of remembering. You go to that fountain, the double fountains in Wall Street in New York, and what you hear is this free fall water, which is the same noise as buildings in free fall, and these fountains are verbatim to the scale of the grounds of those buildings. Compare that to something like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which has no reference to names, no reference to, you just have this kind of visceral re-engagement with a moment that we have no access to. I just wonder how history will play this out, or are we constantly stuck in replaying?
Yeah, well, I think this is not the particular way in which this operates now is not something that's always been the same. It's what Ferrilio argues in The Administration of Fear in this interview, where he basically says that it's his story that goes all the time, right? It's these digital media, they facilitate really fast exchange of information. So what we get into now is that we're continuously exposed to the next disaster or the next thing. So there is no disaster in a time of reflection. There is actually the spectacle, and then there's the next one already there. So we're administering fears rather than dealing with a shocking event and then, you know, letting it sink in. Also because, you know, in the past it might be a little bit more local in your experience. Now you get this sense that it comes from everywhere. On the other hand, it's just a logic also of news, right? Like this video there, or also the work of Arnoud Mick, raw footage. He took many of the outtakes from the Dutch press office of the Yugoslavia war and just showed in this video were very long stretches of soldiers waiting and doing nothing. But that's not news. So the logic of news is that you will usually in this sort of thing not see what it's like in a longer time. It's also, I lived in Palestine for two years, about a decade ago, and the actual sense of trauma, and also where you start to get damaged yourself, is not on that day when you heard the gunshots and they executed somebody on the street. It's actually spending a lot of time with the students I had there. I gave private music lessons, and realizing how deeply they are traumatized by maybe something where nobody died, which was 5 years ago, but which really, you know, did something very particular. You know, that just doesn't fit in the concept of news that we have.
I think we see that through like like in Ukraine, for instance, there's a rise in domestic violence right now. That's often an image that we don't, at least I don't think we hear that in the media very often. That's because of the rise is linked to the conflict and these soldiers coming home with PTSD. Another issue that I think perhaps is getting more coverage now that doesn't.
Yeah, it is getting more coverage, but it's also it's also about how charities kind of use that image then as well to like get your money from you, and then they also avoid the actual kind of real deep work of how people recover from this, like to deal with the systematic side of it. It's about this kind of a poster of someone with no legs that will get us more donations. So it's kind of it's still focusing still a bit on the physical. I don't think the idea of mental health. I think generally in society it's more discussed, but I don't think that PTSD has become like a buzz phrase without a real deep understanding of what that actually means, and it's overused. So I still think there's a lot of work to do around that subject. And also, again, it's heavily gendered towards the male because statistically there are more men in the military.
Domestic violence is heavily toward the female.
Yeah, but I still feel that there's women who have PTSD who served in the military who have definitely gone missing from being discovered or even treated because they are not present in mainstream society as represented as being part of the military. So, and there's a lot less of that happening, and the military's view on this or their statistic is, well, only 9% of the army is women. So it's kind of like, well, they're less, you know, so we don't need to worry about it. The impact of PTSD is not gender specific, right? It's devastating regardless of that. But interestingly, there's also cases of domestic abuse between two gay women who one might have served in the military. Where's that ever again? Nowhere. You know, but it exists, right? So our friends have gone through that. So, yeah.
So unless
From a question one, sorry.
So unless Danny has any more burning imagery that he wants to, or
Burning.
imagery of burning
No
that he
one will
wants to
get
show, I want to be conscious of time, so I'm not entirely sure when we were supposed to begin and end, but if we have time for audience questions, do we? And if anyone has any audience questions, do they have to wait for the microphone? Are we reliant on the microphone for recording, or otherwise it's a small enough space for acoustics to be?
Yeah.
And are there any questions?
Does patriarchy cause all wars?
Does patriarchy cause all wars?
I think it reinforces the patriarchy. I don't know whether it causes war. I've started looking at medieval history now and the role that women played as warriors and as fighters, and they did exist. They were smaller in number, but then if you go to other cultures like the Aztec communities, there's no differentiation between male and female warriors either. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's probably emboldened the patriarchy, yes, for a position of power.
I'm not.
I could blame the patriarchy for everything, but I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that if we lived in a matriarchy, if you look at lots of different animal systems or biological systems, you know, these animals that run in a matriarchy with the queen, they can tend to be very violent.
Yeah,
and also
exactly.
racist as well. So I'm not convinced that if we lived in a matriarchy, that equals a less violent society.
Well, I know lots of violent women, so I don't think that this idea of one or the other really works either way, right? Matriarchy or patriarchy.
But isn't also the fundamental issue both with violence against the environment, but also large-scale warfare, ideas of the H-bomb, that it is, as Dupuy argues, it's a lack of intelligence, because intelligence, like which is a general issue of humans. You know, the idea of intelligence is that you don't go for immediate comfort or gratification. You make a detour to gain something that's better. So the whole idea of the kind of economy that we live in now, but also the idea of waging a large-scale war, it is a sign of a limited level of intelligence not to realize that if you wage this war, then everybody will lose, or if you have an economy that always grows, then everybody will die in the end. So I don't know. If it's that wouldn't be a difference between men and women maybe, but then on the other hand, I mean, there's a book, Michian she's called, who has looked in detail, the book's called Boys Will Be Boys. She's looked in detail at this idea that men are more likely to become violent firearm users and pro-war and things like that. And I think she looks at a lot of research with people who are identified as male or female and twins, but who have the same hormonal disposition. So, and her suggestion is that there does seem to be more tendency to rough and tumble play with people who are hormonally or genetically considered of male sex, but when it goes to an idea of warfare and weapons and things like that, that's completely cultural. So I don't know, but I think the thing is we just don't have any cases to compare it with, right? Because there are no matriarchal societies that are operating on a very large scale at the moment that could be in a position to choose to wage a war like that or not, I believe.
The cultural thing, there is a clue in war memorials, because here in Europe they're all men and horses. In Kazakhstan, the first thing I saw was a war memorial of 2 women. One was a machine gunist and one was a sniper. So I asked my colleagues, this is rather surprising, and they were surprised that I was surprised. And they said, because in Kazakhstan women are equal traditionally, because they help to put up the yurt. And everybody does the same jobs. Everybody rides horses, everybody looks after the animals. It's a much less differentiated society.
When was the memorial?
In Almaty.
But when? Because it
Second World War.
It also sounds like a Soviet thing that sometimes.
Oh, it could well be.
Yeah. So maybe not necessarily tied to Kazakh culture.
Yeah. I mean, that was the explanation I was given. Who knows what it is? But it's an interesting thought. But maybe there's examples.
And if we have time for one final question, anybody? Well, if not, it feels like we've covered a multitude of thematics today. And before Danny plays us out with his video of choice, DJ in the corner, it feels like we've covered things like the sexualization of uniforms, the imagery of indoctrination, the leverage of visceral visual imagery, and yet it still feels like we haven't answered the famous Edwin Starr question, war, what is it good for? We're still none the wiser to some degree. So I do encourage you, like Danny said, his art exhibit is still on the Arbeit Gallery in Hackney Wick, so do go visit that exhibit, and please join me in thanking, as Danny plays us out with the video, these incredible panelists.
This video is not going to be some sort of fun conclusion, but more a point where. So there seems to have been this development that there was a big investment, as we've touched on sometimes, a big investment in this idea of high-tech warfare as something that will save us, that will be just and everything. This thing has completely faded, and we saw the return of this image of maybe the archaic ground warfare model, but now the last clip will show is something where these things in a rather disturbing way seem to all come together. The ultimate anti-tank weapon, the FGM-148 Javelin missile in action. And there's no sound.
The video is mute.
Is it mute?
Yeah.
Is it? Oh, sorry.
Right.
Oh, there you go.
This is like $40,000.
Apparently they cost 150,000. So, but what is fascinating here is what you see here is an American man-portable fire and forget anti-tank missile. So here we see the symbiosis
of what Schwarzkopf introduces in 1991. That's the beginning of fire and forget, right? You push the button and the missile does the job. So this has been highly associated with this idea of a conflict where there are no boots on the grounds anymore, where our guys are sitting behind a screen and are not getting hurt anymore. And this is a kind of thing where it comes together. Now we get the ground war soldier who's operating this fire and forget high-tech piece of weaponry. So there seems to be some kind of a get-together of these two strands in this sort of development. What that means, I don't know, but it is rather fascinating that this is now being profiled quite highly in all sorts of
Do you lock it onto the target first?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the rocket is smart, so to say. Well, Alison knows much better how it works.
Well, there's a separate firing pack. So
okay.
it locates the target, puts a grid, and then it locates the range and then it fires.
With the soldier, or the firing pack is
So you have a firer, so there's two people there.
okay.
The person that fires it and the person that puts it on target. So they've got a little, you can see it there.
So before we're reported to the British police by one of the residents for showing a multitude of available arms, and just realised we're very overlooked here. Please join us at the bar.
We have been investigated by the state prosecution in the Netherlands for allegedly being active in terrorist activity after one of my neighbors turned me in.
That's entirely unrelated to this project. Thank you guys.